This is Karen Johnson, and with me today is Dennis Madden, who was a very instrumental person in the early days of Proctors. Today is August 12th, 2003, and we're going to have a conversation so you can learn more about the history of Proctors. So Dennis, what was your earliest memory of Proctors?
For me, it really goes back prior to opening, because it follows the bicentennial, and there was a certain spirit in the community at that time. And I got a call from one of the bicentennial commission members, Kay Rosendahl, and said to me, "We'd like to have you on the board." And the bicentennial was behind me, and life opened up a little bit, and I just jumped at the chance to be on the Art Center and Theater of Schenectady Board of Directors, because we didn't want to be Proctors back then. We wanted to be ACTS.
Okay, and that was probably 1977?
Yeah.
When the original corporation was formed.
Yes, yeah.
And then what happened?
Each member of the board was given a little assignment. Mine was the property itself. I was in charge of the facility, and so my trips, I worked down at First National on Erie Boulevard, and at noontime I would take my lunch by walking up to Proctor's and climbing the scaffolding and getting way up to the top of the ceiling and see what work the city CETA workers were doing that day on our roof.
So at this time, the
Or
theater
ceiling.
was owned by, still, it was in foreclosure.
It was city-owned at the time.
And the city arranged for there to be manpower, federal manpower, CETA workers.
Yeah, and I think the big thing during that period was Paul. I'm sorry, I don't remember his last name anymore, but Paul was a young worker when Proctor's was built in the 1926, and he worked on the ceiling at that time, and he had some tips on what we could do to the ceiling with the CETA workers and how we could pour sort of latex molds over good areas of the ceiling that still looked good, and then peel them off, pour in plaster, and glue those pieces in place.
So they were actually repairing the ornamental plaster.
Oh, they were.
Piece by piece.
They were. It wasn't great. I mean, some of the pieces didn't look quite right, but compared to the fact that when we came in here, you could literally see the sky through Proctor's ceiling. There were areas that both the roof and the plaster were gone.
So what did you do about that?
One of the first projects of the city, and I don't know if you'll remember this or not, was about a $500,000 project, which including putting on a new roof on Proctor's, then repainting the interior, doing some minor electrical and plumbing works, and then opening up. So those were the things the city was helping us. If the city didn't commit at that time to do those things, the building certainly would have been torn down. There was, we had pigeons flying around inside. We had all the weather coming in at all times. There were
Did you have
flooding.
people living here also?
We had people living in the arcade. At least they used the arcade for a toilet with great frequency. That was a mess, and that was something we had to deal with as well. Just the general feeling downtown was nothing like it is today. The streets were semi-dangerous to be out there. And by the way, at the same time, and I often forget this, this 400 block was going through the great transformation too. It wasn't just Proctor's. It was the Carl Company and the LeGrand Saris and all of those folks using that 400 block to put a canal around the theater. And most of us, I would say, were skeptical but thought, boy, they got to try something, and this is kind of a cool thing. So we had everything was going on here. The buildings were being torn down and renovated for the canal to come in, and we were trying our best to find ways of bringing people in the theater. It was like racing a deadline to get. I know I'm kind of going off topic, but the ceiling was only going to be repaired as long as we could keep scaffolding in the theater. And at that time, and I'm sure this has come up too, General Electric had a rental of the theater, and we wanted to do anything we could to make sure that GE liked us. So we said, oh, got to tear down all the scaffolding, we'll leave the ceiling as far as we can get it, and we'll tear down $40,000 worth of scaffolding, get it in trucks, ship it away, and that's as far as we're going to go at this time. And that's what happened. We had that GE show, and that was, or I wouldn't even say show, that GE rental, and that was the first use of the theater after renovation.
Up with People, as I
Yeah,
recall.
yeah, that's right.
And it was for their 100th anniversary, I believe.
I think so. Yeah.
And it was a big deal.
It was. It was.
And that was before, was that at the time you were thinking about the experimental season, or that you were going to see how things would go?
I think that was part of it, but as you know, there were a few things that the Arts Council did in the theater as fundraisers for our organization, and those things got people thinking of all the wonderful things that could happen on that stage, and that was part of it as well. So it was the GE performance.
Do you remember some of those, what they were?
I remember a few of them. The Arts Council just had like a talent show, like you do at high school. They invited groups to come in and perform, and all of the member groups like Mohawk Valley Chorus and the Octavos and Schenectady Light Opera, Schenectady Civic Players, all of them wanted to be part of that show, and that was like 12 hours long. It was an all-day event, all evening. The longer we got in the evening, the further behind we were on what act was going to be on next, and but it was fun.
Needed a guy with a hook.
Boy, we sure did. We sure did. Another one we did, Cafe Lena, Saratoga, asked us if they could do a benefit for Lena in the theater, and I'm not sure where that came during the process. It might have been even a little bit later on, but I know that was one thing where we had 12 or 14 major folk acts from around the country that came in and sang for Lena, and that was kind of a unusual experience that got us to thinking, what could we do in this theater? What are the things? And frankly, the first year vice president that I was a vice president, Marty Moore was a vice president. Marty had great taste in programming. I think the things that she picked for that very first season were really remarkable, and everybody came. I mean, we filled seats that whole time. Everything was a hit, from the opening night's Blackstone, which was incredible, through the final performance of the previous season, which was a Broadway play, The Wiz. They were all terrific. People got a sense of, if we really had this theater in Schenectady, it would work. It didn't continue that way necessarily, but boy, those first 5 were super.
Well, now there's some great stories about the condition of the theater and what happened on opening night, and I know you were right in the trajectory of some of that.
Yeah, opening night, first of all, it's very exciting. You're talking about a whole bunch of community volunteers that really had no background in theater. I don't think any of us. There were 1 or 2 on the board. Art Govro, for instance, had experience with Schenectady Light Opera. The Lamels, Jim and Marianne, had experience with the Civic Players. So there was some, but I was facilities chairman, and I had to run around that evening doing a lot of strange duties that I really, that were...
Tell us about them.
Well, first of all, just to start off the night, with the magic show like Blackstone, there was an awful lot going on. We were going to have an elephant in the theater that night, several other animals. I think there was a lion, an elephant, a donkey, other things in the act. We had stagehands that weren't real experienced at loading in a show, although we did have a local union in Albany that also participated in the evening. So it's a a long load in. But that night, within 10 minutes of the doors opening to a full house, every seat in Proctors was sold. And then it was 2720. So it's a little larger than it was today, a few more seats. Every toilet in Proctors broke in the on position. All the flush valves were open and water was pouring out of them and they wouldn't close. So we had water literally coming through the restrooms and down the aisles. And everyone dressed for theater in that day. People were in there. It was sort of tux and tie that evening. It really was. People were dressed up like this was the biggest thing that was going to ever happen in town. And here we had sewage water just pouring down the aisles of the theater.
So what did you do?
I had a three-piece suit on, which was my banker's suit, and a tool belt. And the tool belt had everything that Tim Allen would have had on his TV show. I had wrenches and all. I didn't use them very well, but I had them all there. And I rushed down in the basement under the stage and then into the room where they had this great blower that was blowing cool air through the theater, and then under the seats, looking for the sewage line. And I found it. I found that line that came from the back of the theater under the dressing rooms and out to, was it Smith Street? That was the street behind the theater. And found the valve, got the right wrench out, opened it up, and as I opened it up, that was the blockage, and all of the sewage poured out all over me. It
All
exploded.
over your banker suit.
It exploded. It just, boom, it was there. And that was part of it. So we got the sewers running again and then put it back on. But then I went up into the bathrooms because, again, remember, every valve was on the on position, so water just continually flowed. And it turned out that you didn't need to turn them off. You needed to turn them way up so that the water pressure would wash out any of the grit and sand that was in these old unused pipes that barely had any activity for 10 or 12 years, were now just going full time. So it worked.
That was
they
like
stopped.
a baptism.
It was amazing. And then the show. The show was incredible. I mean, to this day, and it was 36 years ago, or 1979, January 2nd or 3rd, that show was incredible. And it had even local touches. Blackstone's wife, Gay Blackstone, found out she was pregnant, and later on she had the baby, and the baby was named after an audience member at the Proctors show that had come up on stage and participated with Harry in one of the tricks. They heard a name they loved, and they said, when the baby was born, the newspaper article credited the little girl at Proctors for the Blackstone child's name.
Amazing.
And that was kind of fun. And then other things that evening, I don't know, I always remember the line that Harry gave about he'd get all the children up on stage with a bird cage. That was his opening act. And he'd stand there with a little bird cage with a bird inside between his hands. And he invited all the children in the audience to come up, and they'd put their hands around the bird cage. And then Harry would make it disappear. So there'd be like 50 children around, hands to the bird cage, and it would disappear. And another one where he had a light bulb that was glowing, float out over the audience. Just such a simple, I don't mean the trick was simple, but such a simple device when you consider people like David Copperfield are going through the Great Wall of China. He had a light bulb, and it just floated out and floated back. And then
How
he brought.
did you see all this stuff if you were in
I
the
was
basement?
I wasn't then, boy. It had already the water had already exploded. They could smell me coming back upstairs,
Okay.
but they couldn't see
Your
me.
poor banker suit.
Yeah,
Not-
yeah. But
Worst
all
for
of those things were just the greatest, and the evening was a great success. I remember another one. Do you remember Michael Brockbank?
Yes.
Is he an attorney?
Yes.
Okay. Mike was invited up on stage, and Harry took off his shirt through his suit. I'll remember that because I try it at home all the time. How did he do this? It doesn't work. Either if Mike was involved in it, he's never confessed to it that I know. He went up on stage, Harry grabbed his shirt and ripped it out and handed him his shirt. He had taken off the tie while Mike didn't even know. He was standing there and he's talking, and Harry's hands are patting him down, stealing his wallet, his wristwatch, and finally his shirt over his head. So that was another little thing. And then the final thing, the show was over, and it was a snowy night downtown. The snow was coming down. We asked Harry if he would go to the Van Dyke and be Marvin's guest with board members and just to enjoy the evening. And he said yes. So we loaded all the animals on the truck, and the truck followed us over to Union Street. Well, I'll just tell you the punchline because that's true, and the facts, the other facts are a little hazy right now. But he actually got the elephant out of the truck to push it out of a snowbank. The elephant pushed its head against the back of the truck, and this 18-wheeler came out. Now, while all that was going on, Bob Grabner from Schenectady Savings at the time,
Yes.
Bob was the treasurer, and he had the tough job because he had to wait till the stage was loaded out, pay the stagehands right then and there, write the checks and give it over, pay the guarantee to the Blackstone troupe. And I think Bob and I were here till about 3 in the morning waiting for that whole thing to be done.
Settling
and he wrote
it out.
the checks. Yeah. So it was a huge night, a lot of fun.
That must have been very memorable, and especially to those who'd been working so hard on this, to see a full house.
Oh,
Must
we
have been
thought we were
wonderful.
what was it, the king of the world.
And
We
it
were
wasn't
all-
the last one either.
No, every show that she picked did well, from Boys of the Loch, I guess, that was a group from the islands north of Scotland. They were here. They told stories about being children over there and listening to WGY at night on the radio. They literally could hear that 50,000 watt station in Ireland at that time. And they were terrific. And I think we had Alvin Ailey Repertory Company, not the first company at that time. And again, that brings back memories to me. Each act has like a nice memory. That one wasn't so nice. We put up on our marquee out front, and I had to change the letters as one of my facilities duties. Alvin Ailey is what we wrote on the marquee, and the contract read that it must be Alvin Ailey Repertory Ensemble, which wasn't the first company. It was sort of the second company of Alvin Ailey. It was a cold day in Schenectady. It was probably a February concert, I'm guessing, maybe not, maybe even into March, but it was really cold. I had this splitting headache, and I had to climb up on the marquee and change the letters, move the ladders 3 feet, change the letters, move this huge ladder, and by the time I was done, I was just frozen and feeling lousy, and you know, couldn't understand why they didn't want to be Alvin Ailey.
This is what the volunteers were doing at that point.
Yeah. Oh,
Hands-on everything, right?
Every bit of.
And was there any paid staff at that time?
Mary Ann Lamel came on board with the Blackstone concert as an interim manager, and she and Sue Burgess, I think, who was Julie Burgess' daughter. Sue was the box office person. And to make that even more remarkable, the box office has this evolution at Proctors. And at that time, each show had 2,720 little pieces of paper with the seat number on it, all stored and stacked in rows in the box office. So whenever somebody came to buy a ticket and they asked for row GG, seat 27 or something, you know, you'd have to go through 2,700 tickets, find that one, and have it paid for and give it out. So it was a very long procedure, which by the way, also proved that we never knew how many tickets were sold, really. I mean, you could kind of keep a count, but there was no automatic, at the end of the day, pushing a button and see, oh, we've sold 220 tickets for that show, and we know we have this many left over, and this many are put aside for artist seats, and this many have been reserved for the press. It was all a manual process and kind of a tough one.
Well, that must have just been a sign of the times, though.
Yeah, no, the computer was not there. In fact, I enjoy saying this too, is when I got to Proctors as executive director, we did not own a table or a typewriter. So we borrowed a manual typewriter. We had a card table that we got out of the Arts Council office, and the seat that the typist had didn't have a bottom to it. We had like a piece of plywood over the top of it. But that was okay because we didn't have a secretary either. My mom came over and would type letters if they needed to get done. Yeah.
So when did you become hired?
I was hired in around the 1st of August, and my first day of work was September 1st,
It was
79.
Okay.
Yeah, 79.
So by that time, the theater had already been turned over to acts.
Yeah, at the Blackstone show, right. Kay Rosendahl borrowed a silver dollar from me, which, again, I worked at the bank, so I brought it that night, and she gave Frank the dollar to pay for the theater to the city. It was a symbolic act, but had to turn over a silver dollar. So.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So when you came in, now you're beginning to develop some staff, as you could afford it. Well, your mom was there, but after a while, there were some other people hired.
Yeah, and they made the job a lot more livable. First, to have somebody help on stage was so important because the details of any show coming to the theater, anybody that isn't in the business would not understand that you have a 10-page financial agreement which details all your responsibilities, but you might have a 30-page technical requirement that you are required to have this many outlets and this much weight on stage to raise props and sets up off the floor, and you have to have this many loaders to unload and unload the truck when it arrives, and they must belong to this union, or in some cases that again wasn't a requirement. But there were technical things that just without a lot of attention to detail, you could get yourself in a lot of trouble every time a show came to town.
Did you have anyone kind of running the backstage at that point?
Mark Legier, who is a projectionist at the Scotia Theater across the river. Mark was one of the people backstage that worked during those first years. Eileen Eggleston worked backstage a lot. There were 2 or 3 others from the union. Harold Perry was the union president of the IATSE local, and Harold was terrific to work with. The stage arrangements at that time were, we didn't feel we could afford to have an all-union crew. Mm-hmm. But the union made an agreement with us that for a union show, they would provide 2/3 of the labor, and non-union would supply 1/3 of the labor. And just the opposite for a non-union show. The locals would do 2/3 of it, the union would supply 1/3. And it worked very well, and their expertise was extremely important because I don't think we had the local expertise at this level. Yeah, you can put one show on at Slock, but it doesn't have 40,000 pounds and 48 ropes, and it just the technical nature of every show just needed that expertise.
What was the general condition of the theater during this period?
I just mentioned 44 ropes. That you're supposed to change about every 5 years because the rope will get
Now
dry
explain
rot.
what the ropes are to someone
To
who-
raise and lower sets on the stage, there are 44 pipes. Every 6 inches, there's another pipe.
A pipe is just a metal.
A pipe like a plumber
Right.
would
It's like
have
your
in
water
house. There's no
pipe.
water running through it, but it's what you hang sets and scenery on. And then above that, there is a metal grid about, I don't know in this theater, but it's about 80 feet above the stage house. And there are various things up there, there are shivs and wheels and other things. And we didn't know what we had or what we needed. Every requirement became a crisis. Do we have enough lines to hang that amount of scenery? Is the grid strong enough to hold all that? Will the rope snap when we try to lift it up? Will it just break and the scenery come crashing to the floors? We had a fire screen made of asbestos. Was that going to hurt everybody's health? Because it was now a 60-year-old piece of asbestos in a very public area that was dried out with lots of airflow and so everything became, can we get through it? And then the main curtain was maroon, but it had these highlights of gray on it, which were 1.5 inches of dust and stuff that had settled on the curtains over the years. So
What do you know about the new curtain that eventually was made?
I know that Mr. Carl found it, his donation, the Carl Company's donation to the theater. It was handmade across the way in the Carl Company. The women in the department did all the hand sewing for the curtain, and the cost, I believe, was estimated at that time, and that's a long time ago, at $50,000. That was the donation that they had made, and it was hung and just gorgeous. The day that went up, it was like a...
You felt new again.
Boy, yeah, really nice.
So you had rug problems, we've heard, and
Yeah, the carpeting had holes in it. I think the worst problem, worse than that, the carpet you could kind of put duct tape on and hold things together, and we did that a lot. You didn't want anybody falling. But the seats, and this is so important, almost every performance in the early years, people came dressed like they were going to a wedding. It was not jeans and shorts like my wonderful outfit today. These were people going out for a night on Broadway. So it was a big deal, and they would sit in these crummy seats that we had with springs that had sprung, and the sharp edge of the spring would come through and catch on somebody's dress or on their suit jacket and tear it. And that was one of the things. Anytime we got a report of that from anybody, we just simply paid for a new, offered them the funds for new clothing. And then Ed Burke would go out there with his duct tape and try to tamp that down too.
So
and that went on until Holbrook's.
how much duct tape do you think you used?
Ed Burke is the most frugal man in Schenectady, and Ed would even straighten bent nails in the basement and spend a day doing that.
Ed was the maintenance supervisor.
Ed was, well, Ed wasn't. Ed worked at the New York State Thruway at the Schenectady entrance. He was a toll keeper, and Ed would come over after work every day and work for 4 hours. And he did that 5 days a week. So he'd work there for 8 hours and here for 4. And we had Louis Gukamus and several other volunteers, men that would, hang out in the basement here. Louis was our electrician. He was a GE, and he was remarkable too. There's another.
Gee, you're wonderful, the names you remember. I'm very impressed.
Louis called me, Farrell Madden. My dad's name was Farrell, and Louis had worked with my father at GE. So he never got the name right, and then he'd apologize and say Dennis, and next time he saw me it was hi Farrell. And Louis, the funniest thing about Lou Wood and Ed's helper, would be that we had all of the power grids in the basement. The boxes where the various current would come into the building. And some of them were frightening because there'd be pieces of metal this wide in each of the, I don't know what to call them, but the lines that came in for the power. And Lou would go down there and he'd say, I'd say, is that line working? And he'd go, yeah, it's working. And I'd
Gingerly.
yeah, no, it wouldn't bother him. He could feel the current. He'd say that, yeah, it's working. But anyway, they had the basement. Ed came in daily and repaired seats and patched carpeting and just did all sorts of things to make sure we could get on with the day. And it was exciting. It was kind of everything was new every day.
I bet it was exciting. Now, so then after that, you started having seasons with more shows, obviously.
Oh yeah, we had a tough fall and found out the board voted that we could not advertise programs. That there was no need to advertise programs because everyone knew we were here and everyone knew what shows were coming, and there were only 2,700 people in the entire region that came to theater anyway. That was kind of I'm not saying it was the board, it was everybody's philosophy. We had done so well in the preview season. They found us, they came, they went to shows, we didn't. So we weren't supposed to have paid advertising. And all of a sudden we found that without paid advertising, the theater was virtually, there'd be 200 or 300. I believe our number for Dizzy Gillespie in the fall of that year was 271 tickets sold for a major act. And that same night, across town at Union College Chapel, James Galway was sold out, and we had 270 some people. So we had this really cool thing that happened. Is Jim Delmonico from WRGB, the general manager of our NBC affiliate at the time, said, I'll get everybody to come over to the theater. You have lunch for them. Tell them your problem, that you need advertising. And when you're done talking, I'll jump up and say, I'll give you free advertising for the year. And we'll show that board that you can fill the house with advertising. So we did that. And after Jim embarrassed everybody by saying, WRGB is going to participate and we'll do free advertising, everybody else in the room said, we'll give you this much advertising free of charge this season, just to prove to the world that with the right advertising, Proctors can fill seats. And they did. And of course it worked. We went from 271 for one show to full houses almost the entire spring.
Great.
Yeah.
So along the way, you must have met a lot of artists that were very interesting. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm thrilled so often by watching like an old movie on TV. I saw one yesterday, and I can sit in front of the TV every day and say, you know what? I know him, Liz. I met him. Yesterday it was Vincent Price was on, and my time with Vincent Price doing Delights and Diversions at Proctors was one of the most scary nights I've ever had in the theater.
Because?
Well, we had, we rented a sound system for every performance. We didn't own a sound system in the early days of the theater. And that night we used these relatively new microphones across the front edge of the stage that were, I believe they're called omnidirectional. They were going to pick up sound no matter where it came from, and then there were a few that were shotgun that were aimed right at somebody that was speaking maybe across stage. So Vincent Price came to town. We went to lunch at La Patisserie, which was open for a very short time just up the street, and had a great lunch. He was an incredible man. His stories he'd tell, just being in somebody's presence that you'd always seen on screen was kind of exciting. And he was wonderful. We went over to the theater. He did a sound check, which lasted about a half hour. And he had always used a wireless mic. That was something he felt comfortable with. But we convinced him at that show, it was so good, you don't need, listen to this. And he'd walk around the stage, and no matter where he was, you could hear. And then he went out in the audience, and I talked to him through the mics, and he said, this is great, I don't need a wireless mic. Then he came back to the theater that evening, a half hour before the doors opened, and the sound man didn't come. The sound man didn't show up. He had overslept, he was still home. So after frantically running around and screaming at me, he ran up to his dressing room and sat down, and then he sent a stagehand down to get me, and he screamed at me for another half hour. And then he came down, and from the first word of the show, the sound was perfect. And he just took this, big sigh. He was confident things were going to go well. The show was going well. We had a full house. And at intermission, he went back to his dressing room, and he then sent for me again, and I thought, I can't take it. But I went up, and he said, here's $30. I want you to go out and get a couple of bottles of wine for after the show, and we'll share them. And he
wanted you to leave and
wonderful,
buy wine?
Buy wine. So I did that. And again, the next morning, the two of us went to the Catholic church on Union Street, the St. John's.
Evangelist.
And we went about 6 o'clock in the morning for the first Mass. And again, the whole time he was here, other than that little brief time between 7 o'clock and the first intermission, he was just the greatest guy. He was super. Hal Holbrook comes to mind because he and the theater have wonderful memories of his visits here. He was the first, in my mind, he was one of the first major donors to the theater. He had come to the theater, had a great experience with the show. He and I got along great. We went out afterwards to a little Ingrid's on J Street. And she had agreed to stay until he got his makeup off, which wasn't until like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, and then make up anything he wanted. So she stayed, and we stayed there having a late dinner and talking and having too much wine. I keep talking about wine. I'm really not a drinker, but wine did a lot for us that night because he said, I want you to have the press at the airport when I leave. Pick me up tomorrow morning and we'll have a press conference at the airport, and I'm going to give the theater $1,000. And again, it doesn't sound like much now, but that was 35 years ago, and that was a nice big commitment. He said, but I'll only give you the $1,000 if you can get 5 other local folks to give $1,000 too. And so he gave the press conference at the airport. We had a heck of a time getting the press to, that time of night, finding people to go to the airport and everything, but they did.
Jim Delmonico probably came
through again. Came through again, and David Lynch from there too helped. And anyway, we did that. Hal left. And then Mary B. in Madison North, an advertising firm on Union Street, said to me and others on the board that, why don't we get Hal to come back and do some ads for Proctors? And I'm sure he'll come because you're such great friends. One night of drinking really doesn't make you old buddies. But I wrote him a letter, and he agreed to come back to Proctors just to do the ads. And Madison North wrote a very fine ad about that he could read when he got here. He was living with Dixie Carter down on the Hudson right out of New York City. He said, Dennis, come down and pick me up. We'll drive to Schenectady. We'll do 2 TV ads. We'll do 2 or 3 radio ads. And then you can drive me back to New York that evening. And that's what we did. I went down and got him. He read the ad. He said, let me try writing one. And he wrote a different one, which was just perfect. but he did all the ads that he was asked to do, and then they were run as sort of, I don't know what to call them, the image building ads. They really weren't about a show that we were going to have, but about what a great place this is, and wouldn't you like to become a part of it?
Branding today.
Branding, that's the word, right? And so he did that. He came back other times. He came back when his seats were dedicated and when the little history museum in the back of the theater was opened. He came back, went to dinner with the entire board over at the Van Dyke, a meal that Marvin had paid for, sat with the Rosendals and talked about sailing, about their love for sailing. They had a boat, the Christina, maybe, that they would literally put on a boat, have it taken over to Holland, and they would sail and spend their time in Europe on their boat. And Hal had just started a worldwide cruise alone, sailing alone around the world. And so he and Hans Rosendahl and Kay, talked about sailing the entire evening, and it was just a great thing. And he came and dedicated the seats.
Tell me a little bit about Marvin Friedman, because he's somebody that I don't think anyone has fully ever appreciated.
He was a great guy. Marvin gave me my first job ever, my first real job at the, not at the Van Dyke, but at the Jamaica Inn, where he was co-owner and manager. And I was 17 years old, and Marvin would wait until the end of the evening and drive me back home to Scotia. I mean, it's pretty nice for the owner of these 2 restaurants at that time to be that kind. When I worked at First National Bank on Erie, once a week Marvin would come down to the bank and bring sundaes for all the tellers. And he'd walk from teller to teller and hand them a little ice cream. And I mean, he
was a genuinely nice person.
Nice. He
But
would
somehow,
have dinners
didn't he-
for the theater all the time. He would invite the performers over afterwards, and it'd be out of Marvin's pocket. These times I certainly didn't have the money to buy those dinners.
Whatever entertaining the theater did, he was really responsible for.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to meet with donors, whatever, he did
Right.
anything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he brought hors d'oeuvres here for parties
And to board meetings. He'd come to board meetings armed and ready to go, and you kind of had a better feeling when you were comfortable and somebody was, just... he was wonderful, a real nice man. Yeah, I miss him. He's a good guy.
Just as Kay Rosendahl, whom you worked with a lot, was
Yeah.
an amazing, understated personality who had just persistence and influence.
She could get anything done. She really could, and she had no fear of failure ever. And she wasn't a bulldozer in the sense that she didn't run over you in the process.
Mm-hmm.
She made you part of the process rather than ordering you about. I loved Kay. It's another one I miss. Her brother just passed away, I saw too. Governor Scranton.
Interesting family. Well, what other things would you like to talk about?
I think it's be fun to just mention maybe 2 other performers.
Okay, great.
Or anything you want, really. But
That's good.
One was Bill Cosby. We had Bill here twice over I'm going to say 11-month period.
Mm-hmm.
And he was here for 4 performances. There were 2 in each evening. And I remember them so well for a lot of reasons. One is he asked me to get the opening act for the first time he was here. And I brought in Michael McCreashan Campbell, a local folk group, who, by the way, Walt Michael, I just booked at another theater recently and still doing great. But anyway, they came and opened, and they were great. We had 2 full houses that evening. They liked the theater so much that one of their album covers was taken from our box seats. So you have them standing in the boxes and then the stage of Proctors behind them, and that's on an album cover. Bill was great. He asked me to pick him up at Schenectady Airport, which I did. I picked him up in a car that was 20 years old, and it wasn't an antique, it was just a clunker. And Bill and I rode to Proctor's in that car. I had a hanger for an antenna. I say all this because I think it's pretty funny having this incredibly wealthy gentleman in the front seat with me, a big cigar going. And he got to the theater, and then first the show was great. And why it was great was usually a comedian gets up and does a routine. And his routine is the situation, not the jokes. So he told totally different jokes at both performances. He was just hilarious for that whole time. And he said to me, when the show's over, I don't walk out and take a second bow. He said, by the time the audience realizes I'm gone, you and I got to be in the car, drive out to the airport. So we did that. You know, the show was over. We got in the car, snowing out. He got in his private plane and went down to, that was that trip. His second time back, equally exciting, because we didn't know we could do a show for 4 performances and still sell it out. And again, it sold out right away. I paid Bill, I'm going to say $90,000 for each of those 2 days. And we were just broke. The theater, you know, we were wondering if we could get through payroll that week. And here's Bill getting his $90,000, and the theater maybe keeping 10 or 15 as our profit. So that night he brought Stanley Jordan, who was a jazz guitarist. And Stanley Jordan was his opening act. And he was the kid that could play a guitar. He plays melody with both hands. So and either hand is used to create the melody, not just creating a note. And he later produced an album called Magic Touch, which was, I think it was on the #1 in the jazz world for something like 80 months in a row. It was that important. Anyway, Bill brought him as his opening act. Again, did a wonderful act, but this was Super Bowl Sunday, and we thought, we're going to die because Super Bowl Sunday, everybody's going to be home watching the Super Bowl, and they're not going to want to be at Bill Cosby. I was wrong. They filled up the house, and Bill was interested in the game, and he placed a bet with one of the stagehands, a bet on the Super Bowl game. Well, all through the show, the stagehands were writing down scores and flashing them to Bill on stage. And they made up the scores. They weren't giving him the real scores. They had the score higher and higher. And Bill was just, he'd look at it. Well, he got off stage and he kind of, he laughed, he chuckled. And again, we took off for the airport, this time with Stanley Jordan in the car and Bill and I. And we got him on his private plane. But he flew from here down to the Penn Relays, where he ran. He actually ran in a senior-like event at the Penn Relays, the mile or quarter that he did. But the reason I bring that up is he donated the $90,000 to the Penn Relays that I had just handed him, and I thought, oh, we could have really used that money, and I think we're just as deserving as the Penn Relays.
He's enjoyed giving money to Penn for a long time.
Yep. So he's one, and the other one is kind of a mother memory, and that is that we did Cary Grant. And that was not financially successful. I'm going to say we lost money on that. I don't know how much, but it was another kind of important program that we did, and really I enjoyed it. But I enjoyed how sweet Cary Grant was to all of the Proctors volunteers. We had the Tuesday ladies, a group of about 7, mostly older women, who would come in and help on usually Tuesday afternoon. They'd fold and stuff envelopes and put stamps on with Ginny Boehm, and she'd organize them and do that. And they heard Cary was in the theater, and they just all rushed down, and one by one they went up on stage, and he gave them all a hug, and he'd stand there and pose for pictures. And we, some of the pictures I have of my mom are of the two of them up on stage. With Norma Burke, Ed's wife,
Yes.
and that's pretty special. Cary did a great show. It was not maybe what most people would think of as a performance, in that they did about 20 minutes of film clips and memories of some of his bringing up baby and other, you know, funny. Mr. Blandings builds his dream house and all this. And then Kerry came out and he kind of said, "Hi, what are your questions?" And then he just answered questions of the audience.
That's more and more a format that
Yeah.
some of the old timers are
Yeah.
taking.
He got, after the show, we went to what used to be the Ramada Inn, and we were alone there, just he and his wife, who was 50 years younger than he was, and a beautiful lady, and Carrie, and the manager, Nancy Nelson, who was the one that we booked the tour from. And we sat there and had an incredible meal. And what just blew me away was he's asking me of my opinion. You know, most of the performers, I mean, most of them are good people, by the way. I ran into very few nasty performers, but it was just, he'd ask me all sorts of things about his performance and what things were better and what things he should change and could I hear him properly. And you know, it was all that kind of, just a very, very nice evening after the show.
That sounds wonderful. Was it Mickey Rooney or somebody
Yeah,
else?
I had, Red Skelton was
Red
maybe
Skelton,
the one you're thinking of. Mickey was here in Sugar Babies, and there's kind of a Mickey Rooney story too, in that Mickey was, he was one of the ones that I wouldn't call extremely friendly. He wasn't nasty or anything, but he came for a week. Sugar Babies sold out. It was a lot of fun. There's a moment in Sugar Babies where, and Broadway does this in several other shows too, but there was a moment where he seemed to forget his lines or mess up a line or something funny happened, and he goes into hysterics and laughs, and everybody on stage is, you know, hands, and everyone's laughing and they're pointing, and the show stops and the audience gets to their feet and they applaud because it's like we're all in there for something that's just happened and it's not going to happen again. It turns out that's like in it every night, the same part of the show getting the same reaction. So that's what, unless you go to 8 performances during the week, you're not going to see that. And a year later, we brought in Sugar Babies, and this time was another older actor, very much like Mickey, maybe bigger in his time, Eddie Bracken, who was, you know, had a lot of movies during that time. He was in Vacation with Chevy Chase. He was the owner of Wally World in the movie Vacation.
A real famous man.
A real. Anyway, Eddie Bracken went to, took his wife and I to the Van Dyke, and again, another experience where Marvin's presence in the whole, you could take somebody to one of the nicest places in town and get a great meal and relax a little bit after the show. But you mentioned Red Skelton. Red has been our family's buddy and friend, and from my kids and my wife and I, we just love him because every time he's been to town, he has spent an inordinate amount of time with us, and it's been hilarious. Red got to town the first time. We had a press conference at the Van Dyke. He walked in. He entertained the reporters for, you had to practically drag him out of there because he just told jokes, and he just about everything you could imagine. He was here for 5 days before the performance, so we spent the week going to Kmart and Walmart and the Carl Company, and we went to every store where Red would go in and entertain the crowd. He would say, "Dennis, I need to go to buy some sweatpants. I like to put those on in the morning and paint and write." And so we'd go to these stores, and he didn't go for that. He went because he needed to entertain people. He just had this he wanted everyone in the store to know he was there, and then he would joke with them and kid with them and put his arm around them and pose for pictures, and And he would just do that every time. And I like to tell folks that one of the times, and it wasn't in Schenectady, but it was with Red again, we were doing that, and I was tired of the same stories and some of the same jokes, and I also didn't want people thinking I was just like hanging on to him at all times. So I said, Red, I'm going to go look at those big screen TVs because I want a big screen TV someday. So I left him, and when the performance was over and I took him back to the airport, he sat down with me, and I had brought my son along, and he said, would you send your son out to get a newspaper? And I said, sure, and gave Connor 50 cents, and he left to get a newspaper. And Red opened up his wallet, and he peeled off 20 $100 bills, and he said, I saw you looking at that TV, and I want you to have it. It's yours.
Wow.
And I thought, that never happened before or after with anyone else. And he said, don't tell anybody. Of course, he's dead now. I feel like I can go back on my promise. And that we did get a 40-inch TV with that money.
So you felt like a good friend.
Yeah. And by the way, he did 2 or 3 other things in town. We went one day for a ride up to Saratoga. Red brought with him his little movie camera. Mm-hmm. And what he would do is every day that he was here, he had these habits. And one of the habits was he would take photos of his day and mail them to his wife the next morning. So he brought his camera. We shot the track. There was no horses there. This was, off season. Mm-hmm. But we literally, got on and let him take some pictures for her. And then Red would come back, and that night he would paint a picture of a clown, and then he would write either part of or in a movement, a piece of music, 2 or 3 minutes of music. He would write some music, which, by the way, he only used his music in his shows. So all the music you would hear from the pit orchestra would be things that Red had written. And then he would write a child's story for a children's book. And he would do that daily. And I swear to you, it was never after 5 in the morning that he wouldn't be on the phone telling me, why don't you come over and have breakfast with me? Bring the kids. I'd take him he'd be doing this probably 18 hours a day.
Wow.
Just incredible energy. The last time I saw him, by the way, he was in a wheelchair almost the whole time until the show started, where he did pratfalls, and he worked without an intermission. He'd do 2.5 hours of the show, be on just like a ball of fire, and then off the stage back in the wheelchair, and we'd go down to the dressing room, and his clothes would be soaking wet, and he'd just almost, collapse every
So
bit of
showbiz
energy.
was
That
what
was
he
him.
did.
Yeah.
Do you, during your being the executive director, the theater started education programs. What about those? Tell me about that.
We had Stephanie Hershen, I think, was actually in charge of the shows. She was a staff member. It was a part-time job at the time. We did a lot of school-time performances. We had a lot of successes with them. There's an interesting thing about school-time performances, and I don't know anything about Proctors, their school time, so I'm not judging anything. I'm just saying it's many of the school-time performances are like 4 underpaid actors in a van with a little bit of makeup and maybe a flat that they put in and open on the stage behind them, and they're usually very underwhelming. And some of the times when you're able to do an adult show for students, it works so much better and is so much more exciting. And there were several instances where people came and they said, you know, if you'll, if you do 2 evening shows, we'll throw in a third one for the kids during the day. And Mummenschanz, I believe, was one of those that we did. And that just really proved to me that that's the kind of quality you love to have for a student show, because the others might keep them away from theater in the future, but some of these shows like Mummenschanz are so incredible that that the kids might actually like to come back.
Yeah, I think there's been you make a good point, but there's been an emphasis on improving the quality. And the way that NYSCA tells you to do that is look at Canada, because they seem to have some wonderful children's performances, and also, I'm sure, in this country now as well. But,
yeah, and we had problems with student performances.
Really?
The main problem, and this is the one that haunts me, it ended up in a court case. We had school snowed out in some of the school districts and not in others, and kids didn't come to the show. And our agreement at that time, in writing with all the schools, was if you can't come to something because of a snow day or other things, we'll give you tickets to the next show that is available. You know, we'll provide tickets to you, but we're not giving you money back. You've made a contract with us, and we're going to have to stick with it. And one of those ended up in court, and it was an odd experience to have to go and argue with a PTA in front of a judge, but we did, and we were supported by the courts, and
it ended.
It ended, yeah, and hopefully they aren't too mad at us, because I think they came back to the next show.
A lot of, you know, it's best you can do, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, Dennis, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it, and you've given us a wonderful background in some things that I'm sure people will be interested in, especially the flavor of the actors. And I want to thank all of you for watching this edition of Oral History at Proctors Theater, and hope you will watch these and other shows and enjoy them as much as hearing from Dennis Madden. Thank you.
Good.